Okay, hello everyone. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to this evening's March 27th strategic overview for LaRouche PAC. And I'll be joined this evening with Michael Stager. What we're going to be discussing tonight, as people know, we just had there was an extraordinary rally that took place with President Donald Trump in Waco. We will be discussing the developments around how many of you are still out there falling for the lies that the financial system is stable, coming from Janet Yellen, coming from the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, from the Fed Chair Jerome Powell, and others in the Biden administration, when we just saw in the recent weeks the collapse of the SVB Signature Bank that has now been bought out by First Citizens Bank, and with the backing of the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury Secretary, who has made clear that they will do everything possible to keep these banks afloat. And how many of you are still falling for the trap that what the process behind the banking system in terms of inflation was only transitory, as we were told on numerous occasions? Now you have the Bank of New York that has been the New York Bank, Signature Bank, that has been recently bought out. So we are in a situation where everything for, as we will discuss, the past 15 years has been a complete disaster around the continued collapse of the banking system. And LaRouche PAC has put forth the solutions which have been needed to address this ongoing collapse. But the other issue at hand is one that, as I said last week, the reason why you're seeing the ongoing attack against President Donald Trump, what Barbara Boyd, in a recent article that she put out that I encourage everyone to read, I'm going to post here now and on the website, latest article, What's Up with Trump, the Crown's Bill of Attainder in Modern Form. I would encourage everyone to read this article. We'll be discussing it here a little bit more tonight. As people know, you have the DA in New York, Braggs, funded by George Soros operation, not just Braggs in New York, but also there are 4 operations that are ongoing of prosecutors calling for actions against President Donald Trump. And these actions that, as Barbara describes in her article, have been a continuation of the coup and the operations that have been run against President Trump in terms of as President Trump declared and outlined in his speech in Waco, where you have the same operations of the Russia collusion lies, of the continued Mueller attacks and lies that were proven through that. And now you have what has been called the Stormy Daniel operation, which, as a result of President Trump now continuing to take the lead in the 2024 presidential election. And what we warned about in terms of the Bushy apparatus, including that which is running Ron DeSanctimonious, Ron DeSantis, and so forth, are behind these continued attacks on President Trump. But the most important thing is, as you will see in the following article here, as I said, we're dealing with an all-out collapse of the financial system, collapse of the physical and productive economy, and that the continued lies that everything's under control, that the banking system will continue to be bailed out at the expense of the American people, at the expense of the productive economy. The real economy has to be stopped, and that we actually have to do what President Trump called for in his recent rally, and what he has made a commitment to, which is to put forth a bold, fast forward-looking vision. And this is the key right now, that Americans have to understand that what this bold, fast forward-looking vision exemplifies are things that, such as what President Trump has called for in building freedom cities, building Renaissance cities. We put out quite a bit of material on this that I encourage listeners, participants on the call live tonight, and also those who will be listening to the call later, to go in and look at the recent Agenda 47 speeches that President Trump has given, where he has declared war, all-out war against the globalists, against those who are out to destroy the Make America Great Again agenda, who has declared, as Trump declared in his Agenda 47 speeches, that he is standing between you, the American people, we, the American people, and the globalist agenda, and that he's not going to back down. And every minute he does that, he is continuing to gain momentum and gain massive support from the American people. The issue at hand, as we'll discuss here tonight, is will we get out of the mindset of being, Americans get out of the mindset of being underlings or being oppressed, and actually take bold action. And as we know, the solutions are right in front of us in terms of the need for what LaRouche PAC has put out in our campaigns of Project Prometheus, developing mass infrastructure in advanced technologies and space exploration and nuclear power, and establishing the solutions for abolishing the Fed and bringing forth a new banking system, the national banking, Hamiltonian banking system. So we'll be discussing those solutions tonight, and the bold vision that President Trump has put forward, and the continued actions that we will be taking with LaRouche PAC on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael so he can continue to develop, and we'll come back in for your comments and discussions afterwards. So let me get you there.
Great, thanks, Keisha. Well, as Keisha just indicated, we're at a very intense moment here, and President Trump also recognizes it, and he wants a dog pile on Ron DeSantis. I like meatball personally. That's the best slap that Trump has given him, but maybe Trump's a little worried about his own figure. But DeSantis is in every way an Ivy League meatball of the worst type. But Trump knows we're at a decisive point in the campaign to consolidate any questions of a possible primary challenge. And he's increasing his round of endorsements. He did a rally in Waco, Texas. And that's critical. It's not critical simply from a tactical political standpoint. Trump knows that at this point, a clear focus strategically for our nation and for the world to see from our nation, a clear strategic perspective and voice is essential to stabilize all the degrees of uncertainty, fear, scheming, and really the people that prey upon these moments, the various financial oligarchs and their parasites who feed on the pessimism, the cynicism, the fear, to try to run all kinds of various operations. This is the same voice Lyndon LaRouche played, and the very principle of this dynamic, as LaRouche recognized himself over the 8 presidential campaigns he ran, is that by its nature, a national presidential campaign is a political science driver. It creates a kind of clarity of focus and mission that is not partisan per se. That's why eliminating any real threats of a real Republican primary, because Kristi Noem and Vivek and others are just not, they're not going to force major debates or contests. It's just not going to happen. But it's a question of a higher principle of what are we as a nation, as a people? And that's defined not by what we've been, which you can argue for till everyone's dead about whether it was all good or all bad, or what parts were good or what parts were bad, or is it more good or more bad? But we are defined ultimately by where we're going. And the presidential campaign, as our founders recognized, capture the imagination of all citizens who want to participate. It's partly why it's so insidious to have these mail-in ballots where everybody and their mother and brother and dog get ballots mailed to them, because it's a voluntary participation. But the presidency, as we all know, the presidential elections create a much higher turnout, a much higher engagement. It's not simply because of the power of the person in the presidency. It's because it's a discussion of what are we, where are we going? And the left marketing on this, the left-wing marketing from Obama and all of this, the hopes and dreams and what was it? Hopes and change. Oh God. They marketed it around what people aspired to, but it was all pretense. It was all superficial. Trump is bringing to bear, as Lyndon LaRouche did, the fundamental questions. Now, Lynn did them from a higher scientific standing point, but Lynn wasn't a viable elected leader. He threatened to fundamentally change the orientation of the country and did that numerous times in policy, as with Reagan. But Trump is prepared to actually take over the power structure of the country, not just as president, but he's declaring war on the very institutions which have worked to undermine our Constitution, that presidency, and specifically targeted people like Lyndon LaRouche because of their own commitments. This is a real political war. This is not an election. This is not merely, and it's certainly not a partisan election, but it is a period of time that was ultimately going to be reached. And it's never reached by objective criteria. Yes, there's a war, and it's a real war. This is not Iraq. This is not Afghanistan. It's not Vietnam. The closest that it may parallel is Korea. But Korea was a real war, as was World War II. Certainly one of the most devastating in human history. The war that's breaking out in Russia and Ukraine is massive. This war, despite what all the media might tell you, that Ukraine's about to take Crimea, Ukraine's about to win, consider that the Russians have mobilized upwards of 500 to 800,000 additional troops, that the Russian army may be as large as 1 million people today. Now that's 20% of the Soviet army. But a 1 million person army could be fielded to battle with 300, 400, 500,000 infantry troops or some type of combat troops deployed. The Ukrainians right now have deployed 80,000 troops as reported in the vicinity of Bakhmut, in the area of Donetsk. And they've made this a major stand. Some people are comparing it to Pickett's charge, the bloody massacre at Gettysburg. But 80,000 troops in direct combat with potentially what are going to be major Russian reinforcements, probably 120 to 200,000 troops, at least in the vicinity. And the Ukrainians may have on reserve another 200,000 troops somewhere in the West. A lot of this is psychological warfare, so it's all ostensible. But this is real war. War like I've never seen. My generation, under 50, under 60, you've never seen full-blown types of combat over small parts of territory of a grinding-like war. It's not World War I, it's not World War II. There's far more advanced technology. It's all aerospace capability, satellite precision, but it's real conflict between major powers. And as Trump has made it clear, he is the only candidate that can prevent World War III. Because if this war continues, under the circumstances we face of a massive economic breakdown, already impacting nations around the world and with major political disruptions, this has no other route than expanding into war. Now, in some sense, that is the desired intention. The war has been launched. It was declared at no later than when Kamala Harris went to the Munich conference in February and explicitly told Ukraine and Zelensky, the kind of transgender pervert, the president of Ukraine, to join NATO. Come on in, let's go, join the war effort. And at that point, the Russians, which had already mobilized their troops, said enough's enough. But the West ensured this would happen. Now, why? You could say that they thought they could win, that the Russians were weak, they might have believed their own lies. But what we've seen since then gives us an even greater sense. And certainly the banking crisis of the last couple of weeks tells us something. But at the time that war was launched, at the end of February, really on the verge of a major invasion by the Ukrainian army into this region of southeast Ukraine along the Russian border. Inflation was already roiling through the United States. Inflation was already afoot. It was called transient. It'll pass. It's a brief moment. We've seen these bumps in the road before. Now, perhaps Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell believed that nonsense, and somehow believed that a war could begin between major powers. The largest, as we've pointed, fertilizer exports, food exports, the inputs to fertilizer, natural gas, and so on. The large energy supply to the German industrial machine would all be compromised. That could all happen, and somehow, and at the same time, the administration could shut down our own fuel supplies, like Keystone, but there are many other examples. And you wouldn't have real inflation, cut supply of critical inputs to food, fuel, and industry, shut that down, jack those prices up through shortages, government-imposed shortages, and at the same time print massive amounts of money, create massive amounts of debt, and monetize that through a central banking system. On top of what you've done for 15 years, which was massive money printing, as we've discussed many times before. So the Federal Reserve started to jack up rates sometime over the summer of 2022, as they realized, maybe this isn't transient. By the end of December of 2022, the FDIC and other government agencies had already determined that $650 billion in losses had accrued on the books of American banks because of Treasury bond holdings. $650 billion. That's the size of Credit Suisse, the major Swiss bank that just went under. That was their total assets value. That's across the US banking system. But some researchers at some universities and business graduate school did some and said, really, it's far greater. It's probably $2 trillion in total losses to assets that are tied to interest rate hikes. It's not the most complicated thing to discuss, but it's detail probably not worth going through. It's just when you raise the rates of new bonds, the old bonds at low rates lose value. These are the losses we're discussing. But they also recognize, these same researchers, that the $2 trillion in losses on US banks was probably triple on an international scale. $6 trillion in losses. But this isn't unexpected. This was known. And at the same time they were raising rates, They knew they would be choking the industrial production, because as much as the banks get cheap credit, so did industry and businesses that could still viably be productive and make a decent profit, or make any profit at all, meet basic costs. We're also able to get cheap credit, low rates. Just like a consumer might get a low rate on a car, an industrial enterprise was getting low rates on their production process, but no longer. The only people making money then were the big banks putting money into the Federal Reserve, getting these high rates. My point is this: the details may be a various comprehension. They know they would create a massive crunch in production, in supply, and we haven't even gotten close to what that looks like yet, because these things are longer term cycles, and we haven't even gotten close to the level of unrealized losses of the banks, because a lot of the debt that's still held has different points which it is reached where the real losses will have to be realized. So you're looking at an increasing banking crisis, but more importantly, a decrease in the investments of real production. And this has always been the main point. The great crime of the 15 years, you could say, was all the money printing to the banks to keep the banking system afloat. That really wasn't the crime. It wasn't wrong to say we should keep the banking system going. But it was wrong to not distinguish between what banking system you're talking about. The banking system that can serve the interests of actual physical production, and to massively invest into physical production of infrastructure, of water, of power, of food supply, and the inputs to food production, those would be critical areas to invest in. And if that had been done for 15 years with massive money printing, we wouldn't be facing a problem today. You would have addressed the actual problem in the banking process, which is to not make a distinction between real production and the speculative gambling that blew out the system in 2008 and has become the dominant system over the last 15 years. Okay, that's a basic analysis of this banking crisis. But my point is that they knew raising these rates would create increased contraction of production. They knew raising these rates would begin to blow out the banking problem. It would create the liquidity crunch and all the other terms you might hear used regarding this banking crisis. The financial oligarchy at an international level, what we've referred to as the British Empire, knows what they're doing. And they know that if you're going to reorganize this banking system, this financial system, so that it's a viable system to help distribute the credit necessary for real production, for the industry, the food, the energy, the jobs, the healthcare, the education, the basic services and road repairs, and the things that keep society and civilization going, you need stability. You need a foundation of peace so that nations can come together. If you sow increasing discord, both domestically, politically, like the indictments against Trump, or internationally against major powers, like the war in Ukraine, where the animosity is only building culturally within both sides, that you can disrupt the ability to create the necessary changes, reforms, overhauls, complete transformations of the current system to be viable for human society. And the war was largely deployed to prevent that type of process. And this is why Trump's presidential campaign and the efforts of LaRouche PAC to help facilitate clarity of strategic vision among the citizens of our country and the world around what really needs to be done today. The level of disruption is severe. Take a country like Argentina, a nation that's been racked with debt problems, lacks of real investment, subjected to the financial predators of hedge funds like Paul Singer, vulture funds like Paul Singer, a big backer of Ron DeSantis, by the way, but a nation with huge productive potential, huge food productive capabilities. They're now facing 100% inflation annually, 100%. You didn't mistake me when I said that's 100% inflation. They've got a drought. They've got a collapse in food production, and you've got increasing political protests and instability. And this is going to spread throughout South America if the conditions continue. Again, this is the lack of a stable orientation towards long-term physical investments. The very questions Trump is proposing and that LaRouche PAC and Lyndon LaRouche have insisted on since like 1971 as the fundamental crux of the change. France had 1 million people in the streets just last week. In Paris alone. These aren't the yellow vests. This is a new wave of protest. Now, France is prone to protest. They want to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. Most Americans think, Crimea River, 64 is not that old. But people aren't protesting because it's an age change. Most of the people protesting aren't 62 years old or 61. They're young people who see the kind of austerity, the kinds of policies Macron and this globalist financial regime are portending for the young people globally. Shorter living spans, less productivity, less optimism culturally, less accomplishments in terms of what we're accomplishing both within our cities, within our families, within individuals, but also as our civilization. We're not committed to accomplishing great things. We're going to do less with more. They see a shortage, they see a collapsing future, a shrinking horizon. And they see the government insisting, you've got to pay the price for that process, for our lack of investment. We'll bail out the banks, we'll have plenty of money for war, but we will not invest into the productive potential of the population. In Germany, because of inflation, the entire public transit sector, all of the trains, all of the metros, all of the light rails, all of the subways shut down today in a massive protest. They're demanding increasing wages because of the rapid inflation, to a large extent because of the war in Ukraine, the shutdown of cheap energy in Germany, which already pays huge amounts. I mean, Americans wouldn't believe the prices they pay. They don't even measure it in gallons. They measure it in liters, a quarter of a gallon. And it's probably $3 a liter. So France and Germany are not a country like Argentina, though incredibly productive as it is not a major player in the world stage. France and Germany are. The instability is beginning to rock these countries. And the level of instability is only going to intensify. So a presidential campaign at this moment moves us out of objective circumstances of rapid decline because of the lack of investment and immediately intervenes on that unique human faculty of creative imagination to provoke in the population not the mistakes or crimes or sins of the past, but what are we going to do with the potential future we have in front of us today? The past will be determined, in essence, the sacrifices made, the lives lost, in some cases needlessly, will be made whole, at least in part, by what we are committed to and accomplish in the future. That's what a presidential campaign asks. It calls upon the best of people to contribute. As Kennedy said, don't ask what your government or country can do for you. Ask what you can do. What can you contribute? What vision do you have? What contribution can you make? This is why Trump's Freedom Cities perspective is just so powerful. Because it sets forth, in the context of the Artemis Project, in the context of a nuclear renaissance, which LaRouche PAC's Project Prometheus has elaborated on, we're talking potentially, 1,000 nuclear power plants initiated over the course of the next, over Trump's 4 years as president, starting with 100 in the first year, a massive increase of the power production of our country. But the building of 10 new cities is to take us out of a kind of collapsing, shrinking pie of places to live, problems to solve, rebuilding infrastructure. One of the things when we build new cities, one of the critical components is going to be building infrastructure like underground rail, subway systems and light rail systems, but also other transit systems or other infrastructure for the housing, for the industry, for the city center, that you can actually access and replace as needed. It's almost impossible to replace the transit and transportation system of New York City or Boston or Chicago. They didn't build these things with the idea that after 50 or 100 years, you'd have to rebuild it. They built it like, oh, it'll be great to have it, like as if it's just a consumer item. Yeah, but how are you going to build it again? How are future generations going to build these? For the first time in human history, we can build advanced modern cities with the idea that we're going to continue to renew them. You could call it a remodeling, but we're going to rebuild, and from the gut standpoint, from the internal workings, to keep the industrial, productive, efficiency, vibrancy, optimism, and beauty of our cities, of our industrial centers, of our places for residence and for raising families, to be not only productive and efficient, but beautiful and renewed. These are the kinds of questions that when we engage in them, you're not going to get 15-minute smart cities that control your behavior. We're not going to instill the kind of globalist neuroses on the development of new frontiers of our civilization, things we've never done before, that call upon our creative imaginations, as well as a lot of talented, skilled workers, many of whom we don't have enough of right now. You're going to build a different kind of citizenry, a different kind of perspective. And as much as Trump is provoking these kinds of questions, as he calls it a quantum leap in living standards, it's also a question of this war. We have to create a condition of peace. It has to be done. We're looking at a potential meat grinder of nearly 80,000 people, likely, given how things look, 80,000 of some of the best Ukrainian troops just grinded down because of the psychotic and insane leadership of this globalist death cult that runs that country. You've got to stop it. So we're at a unique point. And this question of a science driver is just imperative. Because instead of people doing some good things here and there, politically, scientifically, culturally, what we're calling upon and what's unique about a Renaissance-like drive to rebuild our nation is that it creates a singular integrated focus where people look to accomplish the most challenging tasks rapidly, not just something good, interesting, maybe someday useful. How many PhD papers, even in scientific research, are actually put to use? Very, very few. Almost like 0.1% may add to real technological advancement. Certainly that's true from all PhD research papers. But when you actually drive a mission, like the Apollo project to get to the moon, and you call upon your best universities and researchers and labs to contribute to major challenges in that regard, you open up an entirely different dialogue. And you force them to take up questions that need to be solved yesterday. So how do we solve this? It's got to be done. We already needed it. Figure out a solution for this that will viably work and test it rigorously. That kind of process rapidly advances your scientific capabilities, both in research, in focus, in discovery, but in tangible applications to building a society. That same question is what a presidential campaign does today. Trump is working to consolidate it. He's taking nothing for granted in this primary campaign. But Preferably, we eliminate the globalist operations. We create a furor against these insane indictments that Keisha referenced and are covered on our website, which are a direct attack on the basic rule of law and constitutional system. And we mobilize the greatest movement this country and the world has ever seen, because all eyes on the world are looking. Can the United States stabilize? After nearly 50 years of cultural destruction, decay, globalized offshoring of industry and production, science taken over by a green death cult of anti-energy and anti-growth, can the United States reemerge with a clear focus of itself and of a mission for where we go? And that really is the question for us tonight and for this period, because we've reached a certain change. There's an acceleration of this entire dynamic, and the positive aspects we bring to it are perhaps the most irreplaceable. There's going to be a lot of doomsayers, a lot of cynics, a lot of pessimism, a lot of screeching, hollering, but very few people will recognize, just introduce solutions. Bring solutions, bring visions, bring big ideas to the discussion, because increasingly people want to survive. And we're going to recruit a lot of people, unexpected people, to this kind of movement. And it's going to reach certain critical points where you really start to see people coming to the realization that the current regime, the current neoliberal outlook, it's not left or right. It's insane versus sane, destructive versus creative, that they want to join a creative movement with real solutions. And that really is what we've got to build today, or what we've got to accelerate in terms of what we're building. So I'll leave it there, because I definitely want to see what people are thinking. Keisha and I can take questions on a number of things of current events. We'd really like to hear what you're thinking and how you are trying to contribute to this overall process. So Keisha, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, very good. So for those who want to join the discussion, press *9 if you are on the phone line. And when I call you, press *6. And then also if you are on your computer, you can go to the bottom of the screen and press the raise hand feature. I think what's clear, Michael, is that the deep state and the globalists can't win. And those who are trying to push lawfare against President Trump and against the American people, that this is a distraction to exactly what you've outlined here, which is the collapse of the system, which is ongoing, the collapse of the physical production, but also, you think about, I don't know if people realize what is underway, what President Trump had already set into motion. When you talk about this idea, when we've discussed this around the 10 freedom cities, the Renaissance cities, and what it's going to take to build that out, what you'll need, the types of infrastructure, you need water, you need nuclear power. And you're almost talking about a new TVA type program of advanced nuclear power, because you're going to need the most advanced. And President Trump had already set the agenda for advancing and developing nuclear power. I know in his speech, he talked about, he didn't go into nuclear power per se, but he talked about his attacks on the Paris Climate Accord, which is very important, because one of the things that happened, people may not know this, over last week, around the Thursday of last week, is that a hearing took place in Congress on the development of nuclear power, bipartisan leadership. Particularly, the hearing was around Congress member from Tennessee, Chuck Fleischman, and around who represents the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and Byron Donalds, who represents Florida area, who put forth a resolution for congressional support for advanced nuclear power. And in addition to that, we've seen recent developments within the Tennessee Valley Authority, where they've just signed contracts working with GE Hitachi to build their boiling water reactor, BWRX, And this is where the direction of the country, because of the motion that was set under the Biden administration, they made the claims and have been determined to go with green energy, renewable energy, solar, wind, which everybody knows is not going to be conducive to building new Renaissance cities, or for that matter, to actually rebuilding the cities that have been torn apart, as we just saw with Mississippi, with the loss of lives and also whole cities being destroyed. We're going to have a rapid pace of infrastructure development around developing nuclear power and being able to rebuild these cities in a rapid pace. So we can't do that if we are dealing with a British imperial deep state globalist agenda that's out to destroy and tear apart the United States. But I think I wanted to mention that because, I mean, everybody sees all the news about when is President Trump going to be indicted, when are they going to put handcuffs on him and so forth. But at the same time, there is a fight going on in Congress around these developments, such as the development and push for small modular nuclear reactors. There's also coming up here very soon, the launching of the Vogtle plant in Georgia. Nuclear plant has now taken place, and you're going to see more on this. So as we know, that's what we need to be putting at the forefront of everyone's minds in terms of the development of these great science driver missions around nuclear, around some of the programs that we've been discussing here with what we're defining as Project Prometheus, which people should dig more into for sure, because we're at the forefront of that fight. And there's a lot going on that people should be aware of. And I think what just happened in Congress and the development by bipartisan leadership in Congress saying that the way to go is through advanced nuclear power, small modular reactors, and so forth, is something that more and more people need to get behind. So I'm going to go ahead. Just wanted to bring that into discussion around what's needed and more positive around these Renaissance of freedom cities and what President Trump has really set into motion.